QSO Today, episode 436, Jerry Spring, VE6TL. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts Magazine. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo returns on March 25th, 26th, 2023 UTC, or 1800 hours Pacific Daylight Time, Friday the 24th. Our tickets are available now for $15 on the Expo website. If you support what we are doing here at QSO Today, please buy a ticket and come to the Expo. Please tell your friends to also buy a ticket and come to the Expo. It will be our ticket sales this time around that will make our event financially possible and hopefully secure future QSO Today Ham Expos. Jerry Spring, VE6TL, like many hams, got an early start in amateur radio as a teenager, but stepped out of the hobby to nurture a career and family. Upon returning, Jerry revisited his love of vintage World War II gear, vintage transceivers in general, and a love of CW and contesting to make enough contacts for DXCC. For Jerry, both hamshack and workbench are fully operational now and busy. VE6TL is my QSO Today. VE6TL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jerry?
4Z1UG, this is VE6 Tango Lima. Hello, Eric.
Hey, Jerry, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I think the whole idea of electronics and just getting bitten by the bug was when I was a real little kid. I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I had a next-door neighbor that was even younger than me, but he had an older brother. He was a few years older. I was over at the house, at their house one day, and the older brother, Eddie, he showed me this battery and a light bulb, and he put the two together with a wire, and the light bulb went on, and I thought that was the most amazing thing in the whole world. And I wondered how that thing worked. And he said, oh, look, I can put two of these batteries in there and make it even brighter. And I thought, well, that's great. So I had to have one of those things. So I got some batteries and light bulbs. I played with that, and I was just fascinated by electricity. And my parents were very encouraging. They got me some little kits on things, a crystal radio kit. And then my next door neighbor, I found out his dad was into shortwave listening. He had this old Grundig radio from the 50s, and I could pick up the world. And I was just fascinated with that, too. And so it just hearing things from distant lands or whatever. And then one day my dad got me from my wall in my room a National Geographic map of the world, and he mounted it on cardboard and he put it on the wall so that when I'm laying in bed I could just stare at this map of the world and look at all the names and places and things. And I thought, wow, it'd be great if I could visit these places someday or get to know this. I was just fascinated by the world and by things.
What was the hometown?
This was in Windsor, Ontario, right across from Detroit, Michigan.
What did your parents do?
Actually, my dad was a dentist. For some reason, I don't know why that appeared, but he subscribed to National Geographic. And so we got these things, and I guess there was an offer to get a map, and I don't know, I must have said something that showed some curiosity about the world or whatever, and then this thing mysteriously appeared, and it was on my wall forever.
Did your parents have hobbies?
No, not at all. Well, actually, it's not true. My dad became a bird watcher later on.
After you were out of the house, perhaps?
No, actually, when I was a teenager, and I used to enjoy going with him, spend time with him. When I was 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, there was a bird sanctuary or a flyby place on the southernmost point in Canada called Point Pelee. And we used to go there on weekends, and all the birds would travel across the Great Lakes and either rest up there or feed on their way south. So I had a lot of different birds and whatever. It's kind of like DXing, but for different species.
Were you an only child?
No, I had 2 older sisters.
So you're the baby in the family?
That's right. I got yelled at a lot for having radio noise coming from my room.
How did the interest in radio then develop? You have this National Geographic world map. I'm assuming that the neighbor loaned you the Grundig receiver, or did you have your own receiver by this point?
No, I didn't. So what happened was for my 10th birthday, my grandmother gave me a transistor radio. She thought I would enjoy listening to music or whatever. And it was this little purple Japanese radio that was amazing. I used to put it under my pillow at night, and I would tune, and I could pick up stations all over the U.S. and Canada with this thing. I don't know why, but and then my favorite baseball team, the Detroit Tigers, were in the World Series. I think it was 1968, and so I was 11 years old, and I was able to pick up the broadcast from KMOX in St. Louis, which was quite a distance. So I was already hooked on DXing on the AM broadcast band. And I mentioned that to my father. And then for my bar mitzvah, he gave me a Heathkit shortwave receiver, which I still have.
You remember the model number?
It's a GR54. It was a learning experience, put it that way. I put this thing, I didn't know how to solder, so I taught myself. And then, of course, the thing didn't work. And luckily, we had a Heathkit repair store, a general store in Detroit. So we would take this thing across, and the guy gave me a lesson on how to solder and sent me home again.
Oh, and had you resoldered yourself?
Yeah, and parts of it were working now, and I took it back the next time. And so he fixed it, and then we got it back and had to go back a third time because it was not working fully even then. And he said, oh, it was a intermittent tube. And I said, and my dad said, oh, a bum tube. That was the whole problem. So and I still have that thing, and it still works to this day. But so I used to listen to all the shortwave broadcasts, Radio Moscow. I became a member of the Radio Prague Monitor Club. My mother got worried that we were going to get a visit from the Mounties because of listening and all the correspondence with communist countries and whatever. And then one other funny experience was I sent in a signal report to HCJB in Quito, Ecuador, because they offered, if you do that, we'll send you a genuine piece of Ecuadorian faja. I had no idea what faja was. So, and my mother laughed. She thought, oh, we're going to get something funny in the mail. And finally, this envelope arrived, and it said, inside is your genuine Ecuadorian faja. So I didn't know what that was. We opened it up. It was a bookmark, and it was woven and nice colors and whatever. And I looked up in the dictionary, the Spanish dictionary, faja is a strip, or they get fajitas as a little strip.
And you got that from HCJB. Now, that was a very high power, one of the highest power shortwave radio broadcast transmitters in the world at the time?
Yes, it was. I think I read something about them dismantling it, but it was like probably the most powerful.
500,000 watts, something like that?
Something, yeah, colossal.
It was tremendous, yeah.
You could pick it up when nothing else was coming through.
And how were you introduced to ham radio? Did you hear ham radio on the general coverage receiver?
It was interesting. When I was in elementary school, I was interested in all the science books, and this teacher of mine said, oh, you might be interested in this one. And it was a book on ham radio. And it was like the boys' book of amateur radio. It had drawings of people in it. And it was a story about a boy who lived next door to a guy who was a little bit older and had built a hamshack in the backyard, a real shack. And all these noises coming out of it. And then it described all the pieces of equipment and what he could do with this radio. And I thought, that is so cool. And then at the end, it was an American book, and it gave some idea what you needed to do to get your novice license. And I thought, there's no way. I'm not smart enough to do that. So I gave it up. I thought, maybe someday, but there's just no way I'll ever learn all this stuff. It was too complicated. So years later, I met a guy that moved into my neighborhood. He moved from Detroit, to Windsor, and he just got his ham radio license. And so Fred and I became fast friends, and he had these walkie-talkies, CB, and he lived about 3 blocks away, and they didn't quite reach from his house to my house, so we put wires out our windows, made our own extended antennas, and it worked great. I was actually, with 100 milliwatts, able to work some truckers in California, a couple thousand miles away, with 100 milliwatts and this antenna out to the tree.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
It was. So I got hooked on that, and I figured if Fred could get his license, I could do it. And he loaned me the book, and he loaned me his records, because at that time you needed 10 words per minute, Morse code. And so I studied for 6 months and got ready to write my exam. So that's kind of how. And he introduced me to teletype. He had a machine in his basement, and 2 meters and HF, and we ended up building a club station in the high school.
Was Windsor a big town?
100,000 people. We had Centennial High School. It was built or completed around 1967, and so I was there 72, 73. We built, and we had an electronics workshop courses. They taught auto mechanics and electrical house wiring and all kinds of things. So it was partly vocational school, and the electronics teacher was a ham. So he was very sympathetic. We put a vertical up on the roof and a little station up there where they did the house wiring, and so we had a lot of fun with that.
You were age 15 when you got your license?
Yeah, I wrote it when I was 15. I was 16 when I actually received the document.
And your first call sign was?
VE3HCN, which is like cyanic acid. Something like that.
So you were age 16, VE3HCN. Was it like a novice license there? What do they call the first license?
They have 2 classes in Canada, a general and an advanced.
So this was a general?
This was a general license. You had to get pass an exam that was about 2 hours long, everything. I had to take a bus up to London, Ontario, which is a bigger city, 2 hours away. I was 15, went by myself. I was nervous because when they gave you the CW test, if you failed that, and you had to get 100% to pass, 10 words per minute for 3 minutes, receiving and sending. And if you failed that, they sent you home. So I was so nervous, and I went up there, and the guy said, well, let's just do a little practice. So you send to me, let's hear what you can do. And he said, okay, let me just practice. I'll turn the tape recorder on and see if you can copy that. And after a minute of doing that, he said, okay, let's move on to the next part of the exam. So I said, wait, you didn't do the full 3 minutes. He said, it's good enough. So it was really great. And so we had to do all these diagrams and everything else. I studied and studied. It was a lot of fun, but it was nerve-wracking. So I got my license, and my first station, it was a DX40. That's all I could afford. A Heathkit DX40 transmitter and the HR10 receiver. And it was about 60 watts or something I could get out of that to a vertical that was leaning up against what we call the eaves trough, or more people call it the gutter, which actually helped, I found out later. And my first CW contact was, I thought it was contacting Calgary. It was with an IS0, and he was in Cagliari. And I was so nervous, I thought he was sending Calgary.
Where is Cagliari?
It's the capital of Sardinia.
Because I saw on your QRZ page you have and I've actually never seen a map like this where you've actually got a world map with all the little grid squares plugged in.
Yes.
Fascinating, but you've got much of the Western world pretty much covered.
Yeah, there's a website called QSOmap.org. He's done a tremendous amount of work. Mike Sager. I helped him with some of the questions and feedback for the editing portion of that, and contributed a little money towards that because he's done a tremendous amount of work. And so you can plug in all your grid squares and map that. And he also does like real-time mapping for QSO parties and things like that. So if you want to try to cover a state or something like that, it's all sort of real-time.
Is he looking at your logbook in order to fill in the squares?
You can actually import from LOTW, I believe. I've just done it manually where I uploaded my ADIF files.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, I was fascinated by everything. And And Fred, the same guy who got me into the hobby, he went to York University in Toronto, and I visited him, and I was so fascinated with the place. He was doing humanities, but I was still quite interested in science. I was taking all the sciences in high school. He was a year ahead of me. So I applied to the university, various universities, but I hope to get into York so I could hang out with Fred and some other people that he had introduced me to. And so I applied there to both sciences and arts because I liked everything. And on the same day, I got 2 letters back in the mail from York University. I opened the first one and it says, "We regret to inform you that your application to the Faculty of Arts has been denied, and if you want to try again next year." And then I opened the second letter, and it was, "Congratulations, you received a scholarship to the Faculty of Science of the same university." So I went into the science, and they had a program there called Liberal Science, which was kind of combining arts and science, and I started in that. But in the first year, you took general science. You took biology and chemistry and physics and math and all that stuff. So I did all that. And the second year, I went into the liberal science, and I was very unhappy. This physics prof that I ran into in the hallway one day early on in the second year says, "I remember you from first year physics. You were able to understand an argument. You need to go into physics. That liberal science stuff is nonsense." So he grabbed me and signed me up for physics, and that's how I ended up in physics. But I just like learning and the world and everything else, so I did a minor in French literature.
And that actually may apply to Canada, right? Because French is the other language.
Right. I actually went and for one summer I did an immersion program in Ottawa where I had a roommate who was from Quebec learning English. And then the next summer I worked the full summer, actually 4 months in Quebec City, and I didn't speak a word of English.
Yeah, that's the way to learn the language.
Yeah.
You have this physics degree, and where did you go?
So I was really getting burned out by, we have in Canada a 4-year program, whereas it's a little more focused than American programs earlier. And the Americans, I understand, they get more of a focus in their major area in the masters, whereas in Canada, the 4th year is more focused like that. And so I was doing a lot of stuff into quantum physics and plasma physics and whatever. I did an undergraduate thesis. And I found my ham radio stuff really came in handy because I was doing a lot of electronics, and I built a device to measure extremely high temperatures in this. We were actually trying to improve the efficiencies of electric power generating stations in this undergrad thesis I was working on. It's called magnetohydrodynamics. And we were going to produce electricity before the turbines that were using gas or coal-fired produced electricity. We were trying to improve that. So I found the electronics from my ham radio and my knowledge of just how things work came in very handy in that. And so I ended up doing a real interesting thesis on that and building electronics from some of the first generation integrated circuits. And that was like late 1970s. So that was fun. But I got so burnt out on that, I decided I want to actually do something a little different and make some money. So the oil industry at that time was booming, and some buddies of mine that were a little older, graduated the year before me, went into physics, or were making more than their profs, 3 times the salary of their profs after a year or two. So I went, applied to oil companies in Calgary, and I got accepted to a major oil company right away. So I moved the next year or right after I graduated to Calgary.
From an American standpoint, I don't think we realize how much oil and gas is up in Canada. I think Alberta, Calgary are all huge or potential huge gas producers.
We have there's more gas in Alberta than oil, believe it or not. But there's a tremendous amount of oil that still needs to be developed in terms of the tar sands and so on. It's more than the reserves in Saudi Arabia.
Amazing. And it's all there and in Canada, right?
It's there. It's a very tricky thing to extract because you have to mix it with water and you need fresh water and there's environmental concerns and so on. So it has to be done in a proper way. And I wasn't really involved too much with that. I did a lot more exploration for oil and gas in northeast BC. There's still a lot of stuff going on there. But yeah, the whole trend, the Rockies goes from Alaska all the way down to the tip of Tierra del Fuego in South America along the front of the mountain belt. So you go up the Andes and through Mexico and into western United States, Texas, and up through Colorado and into southern Alberta and so on, all the way up. It's just this one giant trend.
Is this what they call oil shale when you say it's tar and sand?
There's oil shale. Yeah, there's oil shale as well. That's a little different. It's a harder rock than the sands. Sand, it's kind of getting off topic a little bit, but it's a technology that's come a long way in the last 2 decades or so. And the shale is what requires a lot of fracking. You have to break it up so that the oil will flow into through the fractures because the pores in the rock are too small.
And now this message from ICOM America. ICOM wants to wish you a Happy New Year. If Santa confused your wish list with that of someone else's, and a new battery-powered weed whacker is displayed under your tree, then it's not too late to return the mistake and head to your favorite ham radio dealer for one or all of the latest ICOM transceivers. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion with base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. It has become the go-to baseband rig for microwave operators. Its features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen display with a live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8 DC power supply, single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, a micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, the HM243 microphone speaker is included, and it supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the ICOM 705 is the optional LC192 backpack. The LC192 includes a special compartment for your IC705 and additional room for accessories. The ICOM ID52A is a VHF-UHF dual-band handheld portable transceiver with D-Star and FM dual-mode functions and is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display. This portable supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. You can even send photos over D-Star using your connected Android device. Other ID52 features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz, VV, VU with dual DV mode, integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and of course it is in an IPX7 waterproof case. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705 as both use batteries, headsets, and the same Android app for D-Star operation. Create your own band opening with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world and is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy, including faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. More features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD with real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed everyone's expectations. This transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. This radio by far is the best HF rig that I have ever owned. I love it for its features and value. When it comes to amateur radio operators justifying a new transceiver purchase, Santa's confusion is one of the best explanations to your significant other, that you're only correcting Santa's embarrassing mistake. 2023 is just beginning, and there's no reason not to enjoy a single day of the new year operating your new ICOM transceiver. Head out to your ICOM dealer today to purchase your new ICOM rig. Be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. For what I read in doing a little bit of research, you've been all over the world. And were you active as a ham radio operator during these days?
I wish. I was so busy with career and family and that sort of thing that I tried. When I first moved to Houston in 1981, I bought a brand new Kenwood TS530, and I was going to get on the air with that, and I put up a vertical, but I hardly had any time to do that. So I would sign, and at that time, I had received the call sign in Calgary, VE6 Charlie November uniform, and I used that /W5 in Texas to operate a little bit, but hardly got on the air. And then I put everything in storage when I left Houston and started going other places. So yeah, I had several assignments where I moved to different countries around the world, and I just didn't have time for it.
I can imagine. I actually did the same thing. So when did you come back to ham radio?
Well, I moved back to Calgary the end of 1998 from Argentina. So in 1999, I thought about it, but my daughter was born in 1992, so she was quite young. And it wasn't until 2004, when she was old enough that and I had more time, that I actually started to get back. And what was funny was I took the family to Toronto, seeing relatives and so on. My sister lives there. And we went to the Ontario Science Centre. And I had visited it many times when I was a kid. And I actually even applied to work there one summer at the museum as a demonstrator or something. And I never got accepted. But I was very fond of their ham radio station. And it was still there after all these years. And there was a guy operating there, and I said, "Oh, I'm a ham from Calgary, and could I operate?" He says, "Sure." I said, "Do you do any CW?" He says, "Oh, nobody knows CW anymore. It's sort of outmoded." And I said, "Oh no, I bet I can still remember it, a little bit." So I went and operated, and I was hooked again. So that was 2004. I said, "I got to go home and build a station."
And what did you discover in 2004? Were there still CW operators, even though he said there weren't?
More than ever. It was like bad information. It was, and what I found out was when they stopped requiring it for the exam, more and more people started doing it. They did it for fun, not because they had to.
I think there's more CW operators now than there ever were.
I agree.
And I think like CW Ops and the Long Island CW Club have kind of helped a lot to kind of bring people back in and give them some proficiency.
So what I had to do in 2004 is I bought a rig. Actually, I found my TS530, and I put up a vertical in the backyard, and I started copying CW, but I had to write it all down. I was so rusty that I wrote it, and I filled, I don't know, hundreds of sheets of paper writing it down until I felt I didn't need to write it anymore. It took about 3 or 4 months.
So you were able to make that transition from writing to just hearing it?
Yeah.
Because I think the CW Academy, I took one of their courses, is great. They are amazing. They encourage you not to write anything, just to kind of start hearing the words in your head.
I did everything wrong according to them, I started with records and the different speeds. Everything was proportional, so it wasn't this way that they teach you the letters at 20 words per minute with long spaces in between, and then they shorten the spaces in between. In fact, I memorized the records basically, and so one of the things that really helped me improve my speed was listening to cipher groups from submarines in the Great Lakes. And I bought this old British World War II receiver called an R1155. I was 15 years old. And for the advanced exam, you had to pass 15 words a minute. And so I needed to get my speed up, and I memorized the record, and I didn't have any others. So this receiver went down to 80 kilohertz. 80 to 100 kilohertz. That was where I was picking up submarines in the Great Lakes, and they were sending 5-character cipher groups to each other to practice their CW. So it was booming in, and that's how I got up to speed on that. But I wrote it all down.
That's pretty remarkable, actually, when you think about it.
Yeah, and I bought that receiver for $25, I remember, and sold it for $30 a couple of years later. And then back in Calgary, 2008 or 9, I found the same model here, and I thought this would be so cool to have one of these things. And of course, it didn't work, and so I ended up buying 5 of them for parts. And I spent 2 winters, took it down to bare metal, and I rebuilt it from scratch and got it working, and then I built a separate power supply and so on to an external speaker or whatever. Then I found the matching transmitter up in Edmonton, and I actually had an article published in the Canadian Amateur Magazine where 2 sets of these transmitters and receivers, a friend of mine, he fixed up another pair. And we got this Australian guy, Russ, VE6VK. He was actually in World War II in the Lancasters in Australia as a radio op, and he knew this radio. We actually had a QSO with the 2 pairs of these rigs, and had the article documented and published in Canadian Amateur about this. I think it was the first time since World War II that we made a contact with these rigs. It was pretty cool.
And were the submarines still there?
No, they're gone.
Do you have pictures of those rigs?
Oh yeah, I do. And I've got 3 of them working now. 3 receivers, 2 transmitters, 2 complete power supplies. I've got on this receiver, they also used it for direction finding. So I've actually got one of the direction finder meters, and a friend of mine built a cabinet. He 3D printed a cabinet for it, so it's pretty cool. It looks authentic.
For direction finding, were they using a loop antenna?
Yes, so that was towed out the back of the plane.
Okay, so you're back in the hobby. You've rediscovered CW. What happened after that? Are you a contester? What's the direction?
My main interest was getting DXCC. I thought that would be so cool. WAS, Worked All States, was okay, but I wanted to get my DXCC. And I told myself, if I'm still interested, a year from now, I'll get a tower and a Yagi, which was the case. So I managed to, I dug the hole for the tower. It was like 6 feet down and 4 feet by 4 feet across. And I felt every night I'd come home and dig up rocks, clay and horrible soil. I felt like I was digging my own grave. I got the concrete base, and we put the tower up and the TH3, and then I replaced that a year later with a TH6, and I started working DX. And I thought, this is so cool. I've now got my childhood dream has come true. I've got this tower and this Yagi, and I'm working the world. And but I realized pretty quick that unless I get into contesting, I'm not going to get DXCC, because there's a lot of stations that are only on the air during contests. So I started getting into contests, and I ran into another ham, a local ham, at the club station. They had a big contest station here, VE6 Alpha Oscar. And so he became sort of my Elmer. He was big into contesting, and that was Dan VE6 Echo X-Ray. And so he kind of took me under his wing, and he wanted me to be his star pupil and get into WRTC and all that kind of stuff. So I ended up early on finishing fourth in my region and trying to qualify for WRTC, and had a lot of fun with it. But then I realized that the way things were, there's no way I would ever qualify here. So I kind of eased off on the contesting, but I still go up to a station near Edmonton several times a year, VE6 Sugar Victor. Gord has got a great station with 2 operating positions and towers, 4 towers, and so on. So I still go up there with the guys and whatever and do some contesting. And I ended up with, so far, 8-band DXCC, and I'm halfway there on 160 meters, but it's pretty hard from a city lot where there's a lot of noise and where we are in the world.
Now, does DXCC, does it matter what the modulation scheme is or what the mode is? I mean, do you get a separate DXCC if you're operating CW than if you're operating single sideband, or is it just the contact to the country regardless of the mode?
There's different certificates for the different modes. There's a general DXCC, which includes all modes, and then there's the breakout for the different, for CW, for voice, and for digital. So there's the 3 different.
So what I alluded to earlier is on your QRZ page, you have all of your certificates. Maybe I haven't dug deep enough into QRZ, although I use it every day. But yours is the first site where I've actually seen where you've got row after row of certificates, maybe 5 across and 20, 30 down. It's quite a large number. What does it take to accumulate those? It seems like, there's a joke about the guy praying to God about winning the lottery. The lottery comes and goes a few times, and finally he says, what is it about me, God, that you're not letting me win the lottery? And a voice calls down from heaven and says, you got to buy a ticket. I apologize for probably screwing that joke up, but the point I'm making is that to have all of that paper means that you had to apply for all of that paper. I mean, it seems to me that's hours and hours of work unless you've got some kind of a way of doing that.
No, it looks like a lot more than it is. So what I decided to do, I found this website, the Digital Modes Club, and it's out of Europe. And they're, so they have FT8, and there's all these things, all these different awards that they will give you. And you don't have to really have confirmation like official contacts from LOTW or something like that. They take your word for it pretty much. So I just downloaded my log. I keep a log, digital log in some free software called Logger 32. And I exported the ADI file, and I just uploaded it to this website. And I soon found myself swamped with, it emailed me back certificates for all these different things. I had no idea. You work so many stations in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa or whatever. All these certificates that just came out of that. So I thought that was pretty cool. And they look so professional. I thought, it'd be kind of fun to put them up there on QRZ. But it wasn't much work at all. It was just accumulation of my logbook over since 2004, basically.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I interviewed Ellen White, W1YL. She just passed away in December, and she worked at the ARRL in the 60s. Apparently, what they used to do, and I never did it, so I don't remember, but if you were involved in a contest or you're going after DXCC, you'd have to send all of your QSL cards to them. They were counting through people's QSL cards to make sure that they actually qualified. What's so interesting is now we don't have to do that. And I'm assuming that if they're confirming contacts on the other side, then they're actually somehow comparing the data the logbooks from both sides in order to make the confirmation. Is it that extensive now?
Well, that all those certificates from the Digital Modes Club, and there's another one that promotes activity on 30 meters. So a bunch of certificates from that. They take your word for it. They look at your log, but they don't compare to other logs that are submitted. So that's much lower standard, I guess, as far as commitment or confirmation compared to LOTW or EQSL or QRZCQ. I've done some of those as well. But, ultimately, I wanted to get the certificates on through the ARL, and LOTW does that. And it used to be something like 12 cents, or it may still be 12 cents or something like that to personally check a card, whereas I think it's a lot cheaper to do the electronic checking, but there still is a fee for that.
It must have been a fantastic amount of man-hours in order to confirm an annual contest or something like that using QSL cards mailed into the ARRL. The idea is kind of mind-blowing.
There are still card checkers. You can become a certified card checker if you're nominated by one, and there's rules for that, and there is one or two here in the Calgary area. So I've actually had some of my cards physically checked to get the certificates in addition to LOTW. And also there's a DXCC challenge plaque, which I got, which is for over 1,000 contacts. And it includes all the different modes and bands. So if you work the same station at a DXpedition in 5 different bands, you get 5 credits towards your DXCC challenge. And then they have endorsements for 1,500 and 2,000 and so on. And so, yeah, there's a lot of checking involved.
What's the current rig?
I am using a Yaesu FTDX 5000 MP, which I bought in 2009, I believe it is, or one of the first ones out. You know it's in the first run because they spelled transceiver wrong on the front cover. They forgot the S, and it had all kinds of bugs in it as well, so I've had to replace all the displays on the front, but it's all working now, and it's a great rig, and so that's my main rig is the 5000. It's a great contest rig, and it's not the easiest to use, but I still really enjoy it. And Gord V6SV has a couple of those, so when I go up contesting, I feel right at home with those as well.
You also collect vintage radios?
I do. I've got a good World War II collection. I'm working on restoring some Mark V aircraft receivers and transmitters from the U.S. I've got, like I said, the British R1155, T1154, and a number of other ones. I just, in the QST that's coming out in February 2023, I've got a 2-page article on restoring a spy transmitter from World War II that is based on a single vacuum tube, 6L6. And I had a lot of fun with that. I have a buddy who's got an amazing collection of World War I and II radios in Lethbridge, which is south of here. Blair V6AGH, a tremendous collection, and he's not able to repair things so well anymore. And so he asked me if I would help him with this radio, which I did. It was a lot of fun. So I gave it back to him after fixing it up for him, and actually made a QSO here locally with it, with 2 watts out, and saw that it was being received all over the U.S. on the reverse beacon.
Did I see that you have some vintage American transceivers too, like the Drake?
Oh, yeah. I have the Drake TR4, which I've restored, an R4 receiver. I've got the Drake 2B, and I'm also into the Arduino stuff, so I built a for the 2B receiver to make it all band. I built a VFO that it plugs into the crystal sockets without crystals and simulates the crystals. So I can work the workbench with it as well as general coverage now. So that was a fun project.
So that's an Arduino-based VFO for the Drake 2B.
Yeah.
Did you write it up?
I've documented all my Arduino experiments, but I didn't publish that one anywhere.
Let's go there for a second. It seems to me that you've gotten into writing code for microcontrollers and using them for ham radio projects. What's the most interesting ham radio project besides the Arduino-based VFO for the Drake 2B?
Well, that was probably one of the most difficult ones or comprehensive ones. I built also designed built the PCB, the printed circuit board for that, and that was a new learning experience too with the software. And I had some help with that, a local ham who's very professional in that. But I also I shunt feed my tower for 80 and 160 meters, and there's a big air variable capacitor. So I decided one day to build with the microcontrollers an interface that would automatically read the signal out of the CAT interface of my rig, read the frequency, and then send a signal out to the capacitor, which is powered by a stepper motor, to set the capacitance to match the lowest SWR at that frequency. I got all that built, got it all working, except that the tower was a little too far from my rig in the basement for the RF to get there. So I'm still working on that. I need a little more powerful transceiver to send the signals to that. So for now, that's still on the shelf, but that was another interesting one.
Why don't you make a store and forward repeater? I mean, you have the Arduino, you probably have the 433 megahertz transceiver.
Yeah. I used a chip a little transceiver that is supposed to work for up to a kilometer away, but for some reason I couldn't quite get the signal, even 20 meters away.
Free space.
Yeah, exactly. So that's still something to complete. More recently, I received for a birthday gift last summer a on-the-air sign. It's got my call sign, and it lights up when you're on the air. Well, I found out that the FT5000, which has a little RCA jack in the back that shorts to ground when you're on the air or when it's transmitting, didn't have a very properly designed circuit, and it quickly blew out, even though it was supposed to handle something of very small voltage and current. So I ended up with Arduino and RF Schottky diode building a sensor. So whenever I'm on the air, it triggers the on-the-air sign, and then it has a delay before it goes off, so I don't modulate it with CW or whatever. So that was most recent.
That's very cool.
ARRL said they were going to publish that. That's for these days.
Did I read that you built a magnetic loop antenna?
Yes.
And that you actually made your own capacitor for it?
Yeah. So I didn't make the capacitor. I used a air variable to figure out what value I needed, but it's a 2-meter diameter loop out of some hardline coax. It's sitting beside the deck in the backyard now. I painted it white so it would be camouflaged with the snow, and it looks pretty good, and it works great on 160 meters. But I tuned it with a air variable, and then I got a compression capacitor in the range that the air variable told me I needed to put in there as a permanent fixture.
Right, so the compression capacitor will handle the power.
I'm not transmitting, it's just for receive.
And that's to get rid of any noise around the house?
My noise is S9 on 160 or greater, but with this loop, it goes right down to 0.
That's a clever idea, because some people will think that, you have to actually have a huge variable capacitor out there under the loop. But if you're only using it for receiving, then it's tune on frequency. I'd actually looked at loops for myself because I have a noise problem here. I build the loop and I'm using a preamp and shoving it all of the signal that it's hearing, being pretty broad band, and then using an SDR to kind of pull out the signal that I want. But it sounds to me like you've come up with a very nice alternative.
Yeah, it works really well. And with the FTDX5000, there's 2 RF preamps. So when I'm on the loop, I switch in both, or the 2 amps, so that I get the gain that I need. Because it's so quiet, I can boost that up.
Well, but it also seems to me what you could also do is you could also measure the capacitance that you need for, say, 80 meters and put a switching relay out there, and then you could have a multi-band receive antenna.
I tried that, but it didn't seem to tune on 80. You have to actually have a concentric loop for that.
Oh, really? Because the loop's too big.
Right.
Right, okay. The loop has to be, what, a sixth of a wavelength?
There's some formula I don't recall, but you could be right. And so Max, VE6RST, built a concentric loop for 80 and 160, and he uses that. He's the one that gave me the plans for the loop, and works very well.
What is hogwash for hamsters?
That's a book I wrote, self-published in 2009. I found, I enjoy writing, I enjoy humor, and there was a guy named Dick Sylvan who wrote a book of cartoons for ham radio. I can't recall what it's called, but anyway, but in my search for humor in ham radio, I didn't find much. So I thought, well, there's maybe a good reason to write my own. And so I started writing stories and jokes and things like that. And then I had about 30, 40 pages, and I contacted Dick, and he said, what you've got is a pamphlet, because what you need to realize is there's two sides to a page in a book. And so you've got 15 pages if you've got 30. And so I ended up spending 2 years, and I came up with this book, which is 110 pages, and of jokes, puns, stories, all kinds of things. And I don't know that I'll ever break even on it, but I'm getting, maybe in a couple more years I'll be getting fairly close. I don't know.
I'll put a link in the show notes page so that people can find your book.
The other thing is that I couldn't justify coming up with an artist, so I actually did all the artwork myself, and I am no artist.
Jerry, what is SASSTAR?
Well, a couple of years ago, when the pandemic hit, we stopped giving the courses. I was co-teaching the basic and advanced ham radio courses, and we started talking amongst the instructors and whatever, and we found that typically in a course we might start with 30 people, and we'd end up with 25 writing the exam and 23 or 24 passing. And then out of those, we'd have maybe 3 or 4, maybe 1 or 2 more on the air. And so where are all the other people that pass the exam? And realize that there's no real facility to help people get on the air once they get certified in ham radio. They get their certificate. So talking about this, we decided we need to do something. So I coined the phrase Southern Alberta Support Team for Amateur Radio, or SASSTAR. And we built our own website, and we also have a Groups.io place where people can ask questions, and we sent emails inviting all the new hams we could think of that were in the courses and in the area of Southern Alberta to join us. And it's been very successful. We've had a lot of people. We started out every 2 weeks for 2 hours on a Monday night, come in and ask questions, and we gave presentations on all sorts of introductory topics. What's a dipole, how to get on the air, what rig makes sense for you, all the different aspects we could think of for ham radio. Some were live demonstrations. We had a session on ham clock. What is ham clock? I hadn't even heard of it at that time. So it was pretty cool, some of the stuff people were coming up with. And it's now once a month, and we just graduated another 22 people from the basic class in December. So we've sent out invitations, and we hope to have them join us next week. Will be the first one of this year, and so we're actually we've got a number of Elmers in the area. They're experts on all different aspects of the hobby. You can't know everything about everything. The hobby is so broad now. So we have people that are into digital FM or digital VHF, UHF, satellite contacts, you name it. All kinds of things. Ballooning is I think one of the big things around here these days. So SASSTAR is helping people bridge the gap. Like once they get their certificate, now there's help to get on the air. In fact, it was written up. There was an article in the Canadian Amateur magazine not long ago, and also it was copied by a group. They call it APSTAR, the Atlantic Provinces Support Team for Amateur Radio. So they're doing it out in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia as well.
What was the response to your cold email to these ham radio licensees who, once they had taken the test, hadn't been contacted? Do you have a sense of their response?
We probably sent out about 50 or 60 emails, and we got 2 or 3 really nasty replies, like, how dare you contact me again? But overwhelmingly, it was positive, and it was like, thank you. We were hoping that, there would be some lifeline to us, and so thank you for that.
I just sent out this week an invitation to speakers, and I sent it out. My mailing list is 25,000 approximately from previous expos, and I can't tell you, I've gotten 10 or 15 messages in the last day or so from people saying, I'm not a speaker, but I'm somebody that wants to see what the next stage is. I haven't been on the air. I've had my license for a few years. Nobody's ever contacted me. It's really quite interesting, and I think that it's needed.
Yeah, it's like getting your driver's license, knowing all the technical aspects of the car, but never having driven. And so you need somebody to take you out and show you how the car responds. Yeah, and so I think ham radio is largely, in fact, it's gotten more complex. You go buy an IC 7300 or whatever, and we did a session on SASTAR. What are all those knobs and buttons on a radio? That was just, one session that we did, and it was like we had questions and answers for 2 hours. So just getting familiar with what's the difference between an AF gain and RF gain, and so people really don't know the basics, even if they've passed the exam.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What could we do better to bring people to the point of having an interest in exploring ham radio?
I had an experience a few years ago. I have a nephew who's a genius kind of type. In fact, he went to MIT and did a double major on full scholarship in engineering. And so when he was over as a young kid, I think he was about 12 or 13 years old, I tried to introduce him to ham radio. I thought, this guy's certainly got the intellect. Does he have the interest? Well, he was interested in it, but right away his mother, my sister, said, he's too busy for that. That's a hobby. We don't want to burden kids these days with hobbies like that aren't going to be of value later on. And I thought of that as a general message, nothing personal, but how do we get the idea across to kids that are really capable, but they're into other stuff. They're playing video games or computer stuff, and rather than getting into ham radio or other hobbies. I remember having a chemistry set when I was a kid, and they don't do that anymore. So I think one of the things that we could do is to put this as part of a curriculum in the school of at least basic electronics and radio. I know they teach some electronics, but they don't really get to spark somebody's creative juices, put it that way, with radio and the experimentation. And one of the things I thought of doing, I have judged the Calgary Youth Science Fair for over 20 years. And to give an award or some incentives for doing projects in radio and building some kind of transmitter or receiver or something related to radio might encourage schools and students to actually do something in that field. You see that they're working. I've seen microcontroller projects. I've seen a lot of biology, which bean grows better with which formulation of minerals and so on. But the radio stuff hasn't been there. So I think we need to get into the schools more. And I know a lot of American schools have done that, but I haven't seen that in Canada.
That brings up a very interesting idea, and that is that could ham radio clubs locally and maybe national organizations even offer additional prizes to science fairs for radio-related projects, and then have maybe a list, at least a go-to list in terms of things that they might want to explore. So it's not like they're going to the library that doesn't exist anymore to find the book on radio. A light that has just gone off in my head that you could encourage by having a nice prize, a prize nicer than figuring out which Grolux light makes a better bean.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we need to have some incentives, some positive messages, and that's one way of doing it. You know, of all the Calgary Science Fair is one of the largest in Canada, and we typically have about 700 entrants every March or April, and I've never seen an experiment entered or a project on radio.
You've got me excited. One of the things, I'm spending a lot of time, unfortunately, doing these brain exercises on the fact that most of the public schools no longer have shop classes. I don't know if that's true in Canada, but they were mostly pulled out of American public schools. And there's a whole, potentially, half a population that are going through American public schools that are not STEM. They think differently. I think in pictures. So math was hard for me, but I can see the black box. I'm the same age as you are, it seems. So I grew up in a environment where there were shop classes and hands-on stuff. But if you're not there, if you're not STEM, then there's no place for you. And what interests me is your sister's reply that he has no time for hobbies, when it seems to me that hobbies could be the wellspring for amazing intellectual growth. It's interesting that the parent has this idea.
Yes, and I think that's where the real problem is, that the parents don't see a value. It's like a musical instrument. Yeah, but they're not going to play guitar and make a living. Well, maybe they are, you know. And so it was the light went on there for me is the response to that, because when I was a kid, I seemed to have all kinds of time to play with stuff.
Right, now kids don't have any time.
Yeah, he was busy with piano lessons and language lessons and other stuff. I don't know. It was all lessons. And I said, when is he being a kid? And it's even safer today, because back when you and I were kids, there was high voltage. I was taking apart televisions, that sort of thing. And there were capacitors that were charged up, and I remember getting a few shocks here and there. But today, with 5 volts or 3.3 volts and Arduinos or whatever, there's no safety issue.
I've had this conversation probably 300 times on the QSO Today podcast, where if our parents really knew what was happening in our rooms with the high voltage stuff, they probably wouldn't have let us do this. But, you know, how many of us got a bite from the chassis we were working on?
I was almost killed. Twice, electrocution. So I have a healthy respect for it. One, I was actually unconscious for I don't know how long.
Did your parents ever know?
I told my dad years later, and he says, too bad, I could have collected the insurance.
We did a lot of things when we were kids that probably would be considered unsafe now.
We played with black powder.
Some people did, yes, that's true. I didn't, but I actually had a friend in high school who played with all kinds of black powders and ended up becoming an astronaut because he loved putting things into space.
Yeah. One last thing I wanted to mention was on the same topic, though, is that when you encourage people with their hobbies and like ham radio, some of the greatest scientists or people that have had a huge impact on the world came out of ham radio practical experience rather than having advanced degrees in things. And the one hero I really enjoyed learning a lot about is somebody that nobody's ever heard of, and his name is Joe Desch, D-E-S-C-H. And he was born in Dayton, Ohio, and he became the lead scientist developing the machines that broke the German and Japanese codes in World War II for the Americans. We've all heard about the Enigma project and all that, but actually he developed superior technology to what the British were doing and were able to break the 4-wheel code.
That was the Alan Turing. Alan Turing was the British guy.
Yeah, in fact, he went over and talked to Alan Turing and brought Alan Turing over to Dayton a couple of times and during all this thing. And they developed these machines that were eventually moved into Washington, D.C. or next door to it. But Joe Dash was a ham operator, and his experience helped him figure out, and of course he was brilliant on his own, but he never got a degree, never went to college. And this whole thing took place in Dayton, Ohio, and it's all been torn down and disappeared since then, but fascinating story. And he went on to try to develop digital technology with vacuum tube. He still believed that they could be better than transistors even in the 60s. But he was amazing, and it all came out of ham radio and his hobby.
I know what sparked this conversation that I've been having with myself. This last week I heard an interview between Temple Grandin. She's autistic on the one hand, but she's revolutionized the meat packing industry with instruments to manage cattle in such a way that they're not spooked by the slaughterhouse experience. And Jordan Peterson, who, as a clinical psychologist, kind of summarized what she's talking about. What she was talking about was the people that have had the most success in the cattle industry in terms of processing are people who aren't MIT scientists. They're people that are in the shops in the back who see that there's a problem, and they kind of have this idea, this ability to black box what's going in, what's coming out, and why is it not working, and creating patentable technology that actually has revolutionized the meatpacking industry. And she was the one that was saying that, by pulling all of these shop classes out of public schools, that in the end we're missing now in our society people that actually understand how things work.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's a lot of the simple things we take for granted. We always assume that when we turn on the faucet, the water will flow, or that, when we flush the toilet, that the water will flow out. But she says there's all kinds of people that are required to make sure those systems continue to operate.
That's a 100% accurate observation. We're losing that. My friend Max, I mentioned earlier, he teaches machining in a community college in Edmonton. And the people that are going through there are just hopeless. They don't have the math background or very simple math. They can't add fractions. They don't have the hands-on. It's just we've lost this sort of know-how by doing. The guy that comes up on the farm who can fix anything because he's had to fix it himself. There's no one else to rely on, and figured it out, or watch somebody figure it out in front of him. And now he knows how to do it and pass this on. And the same with radio. I've been working on, someone gave me an HW101, an old Heathkit transceiver, and I've been working on that and trying to sort out all kinds of problems with that. And having seen all this stuff before, it's fun, and you can do it. But try showing somebody who's grown up today without that background and it's just like this one guy who graduated out of our ham radio courses. His first radio was a SDR. He bought a Flex. And so I said, no, you don't want to start there. You want to start with a radio that has knobs and dials. And I couldn't convince him. And then 2 years later, he said, I wish I had started, as you told me, with this, because I didn't really appreciate all these different circuits, what they're doing. It's all electronic settings now.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio today?
I think the resurgence of CW and just, there's been a lot of the digital stuff. And I expected when FT8 became really, really popular that it would be kind of a fad or a wave. And it's still that way in large part. But more and more people are discovering there's other parts to the hobby and other things to do than my computer talking to your computer. And the CW stuff has really taken off. And I've seen, we had one of the founders of CW Academy on SASTAR, and he gave a real impassioned speech and presentation and got a number of local people to sign up. And the passion that they have, and it's been spreading, I think has sort of encouraged me to keep doing that, and it's been wonderful to see that people are actually rediscovering things that we expected to have gone away, and so I think that there's a lot of hope for that. DXing the old-fashioned way.
Well, I have to tell you, I took a CW Academy course. I've said this before. They're amazing. These guys know exactly how to teach CW to a whole bunch of different people. They've got all the tools. If you can get into their courses, that's now the entry bar, is if you can get into their courses because they're in such demand, they are amazing. I've also heard that the Long Island CW Club is also a great place to go in order to develop your CW skills. Well, I think that's very cool that excites you. Are you operating some QRP CW too?
Yes, I've actually got a QRP rig for 60 meters, which a QCX Mini, which I built, and then I wasn't getting any contact, so I actually built their amplifier. It's not designed for 60 meters, but I was talking with Hans or emailing back and forth, and he told me how to modify it for 60 meters. So I have a 25-watt signal on 60 meters, and still not finding a whole lot. There's mostly FT8 there, but I have QRP rigs for 20, 30, and 40 meters as well that I've built. And so I do that when conditions are good. I really enjoy QRP. In fact, I built an Arduino controller so that I can automatically switch from any of 3 different QRP rigs, because they're all single banders. To switch bands, I just select it with my Arduino controller, and it automatically switches the headphone and the antenna and the rig to whichever rig I want to use.
No, that's clever. Are you taking them into the field at all?
No, I haven't got to that point. I've done a lot of field days and whatever, but I haven't gone portable with that yet.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
If you're returning, it's usually the typical scenario is one that I did. I worked for many years, got out of the hobby after starting as a kid, and then got back in after I had more time. And there's a lot of people in that that feel overwhelmed if they try to get back in. And so my advice is to find a group locally, find somebody locally and talk to them and see what they're doing. It's got to be a personal back and forth so that you can feel more comfortable with what it is. Because if you just sit back and say, well, I want to get back in the hobby, and you look at it, you're overwhelmed. You pick up a QST magazine or a CQ magazine and you just don't understand it, and you don't know where to go, and it's just too much. So find someone locally to talk to, and there's so many people that just love to talk about it. They'll talk your ear off. So that would be the first thing. As far as new hams, it's almost the same thing. Go meet somebody, go to their house, go see what their station is, ask as many questions as you can, and get a feel for it if it's something you want to do more of. You might get turned off or you may get turned on. It's just, again, so much based on personal contact and experience with others. And I have yet to meet a ham who wouldn't just love to spend hours and hours talking to a prospective ham on what all this stuff is and what they can do with it.
You didn't say to join a club.
My experience with clubs has not been very positive. I don't want to say too much in that regard. They have a place, but unfortunately when you get several people together, and that several can be 3 or 4 or more, politics seems to crop up, and the club doesn't seem to function very well, and they tend to scare people off. My advice would be to stay away from clubs and stick with 1 or 2 people that you can get to know fairly well.
The personal touch, then.
Yes.
Jerry, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I'd actually had somebody send me a message and said, you've got to talk to Jerry Spring, VE6TL, because he's a mentor, he's very active in the area, and so I'm so glad that I reached out to you and that we had this chance to have our QSO today. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a lot of fun. 73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jerry. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday and put in VE6TL in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to check on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates that include our speakers now and presentations that are on the website. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.